looking into 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. I'll read several verses with you. This is another one of those passages that maybe you're not all familiar with, probably not one you spend a lot of time with. Maybe if you read through the Old Testament, like in the daily routine, you might have hit it. But probably one doesn't stick in your mind too much. It's a story about the first king of Israel, King Saul. I'm going to be bouncing around a little bit in this passage, but we're going to stay mostly in 1 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to start reading with verse 4. So Saul mobilized his army at Telaim. There were 200,000 troops in addition to 10,000 men from Judah. Then Saul went to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. And Saul sent this message to the Kenites: "Move away from where the Amalekites live, or else you'll die with them. For you were kind to the people of Israel when we came up from Egypt." So the Kenites packed up and left. Then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and the cattle and the fat calves and lambs and everything. In fact, it appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or poor quality. Then the Lord said to Samuel, "I'm sorry I ever made King Saul, for he had not been loyal to me. He's again refused to obey me." Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this, he cried out to the Lord all night. Early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul, and someone told him Saul went up to Carmel to set up a monument to himself. Then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. "May the Lord bless you," he said. "I've carried out the Lord's command." "Then what is all the bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the oxen I hear?" Samuel demanded. "Well, it's true, the army spared the best of the sheep and the cattle," Saul admitted, "but they're going to sacrifice unto the Lord your God. We destroyed everything else." Samuel said, "So stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night." "What was it?" Saul asked. Samuel said, "Although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king. And the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, go and completely destroy the sinners of the Amalekites until they're all dead. Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you rush for the plunder and not do exactly what the Lord said to do?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul insisted. I carried out the mission he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everything else. Then my troops brought the best of the sheep and the cattle and the plunder, the sacrifice of the Lord your God in Gilgal." Samuel said, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Obedience is far better than sacrifice. Listening to him is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as bad as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he's rejected you from being king." Then Saul finally admitted, "Yes, I have sinned. I've disobeyed your instruction in the Lord's command, but I was afraid of the people, and I did what they demanded. Oh, please forgive my sin now, and go with me to worship the Lord." But Samuel said, "I'll not return with you. Since you've rejected the Lord's command, he's rejected you from being king of Israel." But as Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed him as he tried to go away and tore his robe. And Samuel said, "See, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to someone else, one who's better than you. He who is God of Israel, for the glory of Israel, will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he's not a human that he should change his mind." Then Saul pleaded again, I know I've sinned, but please at least honor me before the leaders and before the people by going with me to worship the Lord your God." So Samuel finally agreed and went with them, and Saul worshiped the Lord. This passage is always kind of fascinating to me for a couple of reasons. One, I think in a way, when you look at it, it's one of the most humorous passages in the Bible. And maybe we'll see that humor in a little bit. On the other hand, it's also one of the most tragic passages in the Bible. Because what you're seeing here is the downfall of a man of God. I know sometimes when we watch television, we see some big televangelist or some famous preacher, get caught in his sin. Sometimes we're kind of inclined to say, well, I always thought there was something wrong about him, or, always kind of to snipe it. They say, just like sharks in the water when a Christian falls, but we should be brokenhearted when a Christian falls. And I say it's one of the most tragic stories you ever hear. You say, well, Dr. Weeder, how can you say that? That's one of the most tragic stories. Think about it. You look at the tragic stories you mentioned earlier. Hundreds of people killed by chemical attacks, raging wildfires out west, senseless murders in Duncan, Oklahoma. I mean, there's a lot more tragic stories in this story. I don't know, because this is the story of a man falling away from God. And when a man falls from God, is rejected by God, it has eternal consequences, not just consequences in this life. And the really sad thing about this story is it didn't have to be this way. If anybody started off well and had a chance to make it, it was Saul. In fact, Saul was the kind of man at the beginning of his life that every one of us would aspire to. We want our kids to grow up and be like him. We want to be like him ourselves when we grow up, if we're men. Let me remind you of his story. You go back about 1 Samuel chapter 8 or so, the people decided they wanted a king. And Samuel didn't want them to have a king because God was supposed to be their king, but God finally gave in, and he chose Saul to be their king. And if you go back and read about Saul, you discover some things about him. It said he was a head and shoulders taller than everybody else. Because he's him on the basketball team down at OW probably. He was brave. He was a great war leader. He led them in a battle right at the beginning to defeat their enemies. He was a man who forgave people because there were those who didn't want Saul to be king. But once he won a great victory, his allies wanted to go back and punish them. He said, no, let them go. They had a right to make their choice. And even beyond that, the Bible says, very interestingly in 1 Samuel chapter 9, that it said God changed his heart. God gave him a new heart, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And he was such a humble man, when they chose him to be king, they couldn't find him because he was off hiding behind some luggage because he didn't feel he was worthy to be king. If anybody ever had a good start, it was Saul. If anybody ever had a chance to lead his people and do what was right, it was Saul. And yet here we find it says God rejected him. So what happened, Dr. Weed? What went wrong? Well, if you read the story throughout 1 Samuel, you'll discover over a period of time that several things went wrong. Another part of his personality began to rise up. That of jealousy and envy. David comes on the scene. He becomes a great hero of the people. They start singing songs like, well, Saul's killed his thousands, but David's killed his 10,000s. And Saul became jealous of him and tried to kill David on a number of occasions. We began to see that he had a fear for the people. He was much more worried about what the people thought about him than what God thought about him. And he shows a lack of faith and a lack of judgment and a recklessness and a rebellion in his nature. And after a while it became clear that maybe he wasn't the man to be king. So God apparently sends two tests, or at least we have two examples of Saul's failure. The first one's a chapter or two back. The people of Israel were going to war against their hereditary enemies, the Philistines, and they were supposed to wait there until Samuel came and he would offer a sacrifice for their victory. Samuel was the priest. But as they waited, Samuel didn't show up. And people began to get restless. And they began to slip away. And they began to desert. And finally Saul says, I can't wait any longer. I will go ahead and offer this sacrifice. And he disobeyed the law of God and offered a sacrifice in the priest's place. Well, that might have been enough, but maybe God's merciful, or maybe He just wanted another example for us to look at. But He comes and gives Saul another task to test his obedience. And He tells us here in chapter 15, I want you to go out and destroy the Amalekites. Now, I'll confess to you, those kind of passages in the Old Testament are difficult to know what to do with when God orders a destruction of the people. I do know, if you go back and read earlier in the book, and clear back in actually in Exodus and Numbers and so on, that the Amalekites were their most ancient enemy. They were the very first one to attack the people of Israel when they came out of the wilderness. They would not let them pass to their country. And clear back in the book of Deuteronomy, God swore a time will come when these people will be destroyed. So God comes to Saul as the king, says, now the time has come. I want you to go out and utterly destroy these people. Just like He's commanded when Joshua came in and took Jericho. So He gathers His armies. He attacks the Amalekites, and notice this, he almost totally destroyed them. Now, again, God had called for total destructions, and Saul almost carried out the will of God. But almost not enough. Now, rather than completely destroy the Amalekites, it said when it came right down to it, I guess Saul thought to himself, what a waste. Why don't I want to destroy all the good sheep and the oxen and the goats and the horses? In fact, it says they only destroyed the things that were worthless or of poor quality. What a waste to destroy all of these things when we could keep them and do something else with them. And then He also spared King Agag. Now, we don't know why for sure. I don't know if he was holding him hostage in case Agag had some allies out there and they might want to attack Israel. I don't know if he thought, well, maybe I might want to make a treaty with him someday. Personally, I kind of have the opinion, he just wanted to drag him back in chains. He wanted to bring him back in chains behind his chariot so the people could see what a great king he was and hear the accolades of the crowd. And whatever the reason was, he was almost obedient. That wasn't good enough. Take this thought away. You know, you always hear preachers say something like, well, if you don't get anything else out of this sermon, well, here's one thing. Almost isn't good enough when it comes to God. Now, I don't claim to have any discernment. I don't know where you stand with God. That's between you and the Lord. But I'm telling you what, being an almost Christian is not good enough. Well, but I come to church. You know, I belong somewhere. I was baptized at that time in the past, and I show up on a Sunday morning, and I sing the songs, and I sit there and put money in the offering plate, and I listen to the sermon. But being almost a Christian is not enough if Christ is not your Savior. Ask King Agrippa in the book of Acts when he tells Paul, almost you persuaded